Hello and welcome, you cozy couch potatoes.
Hello, my cozy couch potatoes. This is Spice Rex Studios, a cozy couch, and we are continuing with the City of Ember series, The People of Sparks book number 2. We were on, I believe, chapter 17. You're probably wondering about my setup right now. One child is napping upstairs, the other is watching a movie in the living room, and I want them to stay content so I can get some stuff done in here and in here. So bear with my lovely floor sitting for this episode, maybe a couple episodes, depending on how much I get done. So let's recap Chapter 16. Chapter 16 was about Lena and her trip with Casper and Maddie. They're not at the city yet, but they're almost. But they ran into someone who then stole from them because Casper would not give him any food. He was starving and he would not give him any food. Maddie disagreed, but Casper's the boss. So they got into a little argument, but then they carried on, and I think he said the next day they get to the city. I'm so excited for that. But it seems like Chapter 7 is not that day. We are going back to Doon at Sparks because Chapter 17 is called Doon Accused. So, let's dive into Chapter 17. Doon Accused. Word of the tomato throwing and Torin's accusation of Doon spread quickly through Sparks. Some people believed Torin, some didn't. But no one could prove who was telling the truth. Torin said he'd seen what he'd seen in the middle of the night, when he couldn't sleep and took a walk to the field to look at the stars. Doon said he'd been home all night, sleeping, and that his father and the others in his room knew it. But people said he could have slipped quietly out without anyone knowing. Couldn't he? He could have gone down there and done his mischief and come back, and they all would have thought he'd been sleeping the whole night. At noon that day, when he and the others showed up at the patron's house for their midday meal, no one spoke to them. Martha let them in, and they sat down at the table, where places had been set for them as usual. Doon's father said, "Good day," and Mrs. Polster said, "How are you?" And Miss Thorne and Edward Pocket looked around at the family's stony faces and tried to smile. Ordney put food on their plates, was it an even smaller amount than usual, and passed the plates to them. Kenny ate tiny mouthfuls. His eyes darted nervously from face to face, but no one spoke. Finally, Doon's father said, "Excuse me, but perhaps there's been a mistake." Martha looked at him coldly. "I don't believe so," she said. "Perhaps you're thinking," Doon's father went on, "that my son, Doon, actually did what he has been accused of." "In this household," said Martha, "we do not approve of wasting food." "Neither do we," cried Doon. "I would never do such a thing. I didn't do it." All eyes turned toward Doon. He could feel a red flush rising in his face. "Really," he said, keeping his voice calm, "I didn't." "Who did, then?" said Orny. "I don't know," said Doon. "No one knows," said Mrs. Polster in her firmest voice. "Certainly we aren't going to believe the word of one unhappy little boy against the word of this young man who has proved himself so outstanding." "Yeah, defend your Doon." "Why not?" said Martha. "Torin Crane is a decent boy as far as I know. I don't see why you call him unhappy." "All you have to do is look at him," Mrs. Bolster said. Miss Thorne nodded. "I do think she's right," she murmured. "Well, one of you people must have done it," Martha said. "Certainly none of us would have." "Well, one of you did, and it was Torin." "Nothing has been proved one way or the other," said Doon's father. "It would be unfair to draw any conclusions." There was an uncomfortable silence. Everyone focused on eating. When it was time to leave, Kenny passed out the food parcels, and as he handed one to Doon, he silently mouthed 3 words. "I believe you." Good. I thought Kenny would, but Kenny's not brave enough to go against his parents. At least one person was on his side, Doon thought. Well, you have the people of Ember on your side, Doon. So it's not just one, but I bet you mean one person from Sparks. At least one person was on his side, Doon thought. It made him feel better, but only a little. In the end, because it was one person's word against another, and there was no proof either way, nothing was done. Officially, the identity of the tomato thrower remained a mystery, but the effect of all this was to make the people of Sparks and the people of Ember even more resentful and suspicious of each other than they had been before. Doon felt unfriendly eyes following him wherever he went. At first he tried to explain when people glared at him that way. He spoke reasonably. "Why would I get up and walk all the way into a field in the middle of the night to throw tomatoes at a wall?" he said. "It doesn't make any sense." But people didn't seem interested in reason. He was one of them, and that meant he was strange and might do anything. So Doon stopped trying to explain. He kept his eyes on the ground and ignored the people who muttered darkly as he passed by. It wasn't just Doon who suffered from the tomato incident. It was all the refugees from Ember. Sometimes the villagers called them names right out loud on the street. It was as if those smashed tomatoes had brought all the quietly rumbling resentments out into the open. The town simmered like a pot about to boil over. One morning, Doon found a crowd gathered in the plaza when he came into town for work. Both Sparks people and Ember people were clustered together, looking at something. He edged between them to see what it was. Across the pavement, someone had scrawled a message. It looked as if it had been written in mud. The sloppy running letters said, "They must go," all caps. The crowd stared at it silently. A few of the villagers seemed embarrassed. They looked sideways at the Emberites and shook their heads. "Mean," someone muttered, but others scowled. One man, noticing Doon, glared at him so angrily that Doon felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. This message was there because of him. He knew it. He put his head down and hurried away. Poor Doon. Too bad Lena didn't take Doon with him. This wouldn't have happened to Doon. Would have happened to someone in Ember, but... At the hotel that night, people were upset. They clustered in buzzing groups out by the front steps, talking about the words painted on the plaza. Doon saw Tick striding among them, speaking with everyone. His face was flushed and his eyes glittering. When he came toward Doon, he paused. They've turned against us," he said. "I knew they would. We mustn't stand for it." And he plunged back into the crowd. A day passed, and then another. The sun blazed down, but Doon felt as if darkness had invaded him. Protests and questions raged through his mind. Why had Torin pointed at him? Was it just at random, or had he signaled him out for some reason? Why did Chugger believe Torin and not believe him? Who had written the muddy message on the bricks of the plaza? Lena did not return, and this added to Doon's gloomness. According to the note she'd left Mrs. Murdo, she should have been back by now from wherever she'd gone. Doon's feelings about her were divided between worry and anger. He tried not to think about her, since there was nothing he could do. Whenever he had a free moment, he holed up with a book and tried to forget about what was happening in the village. Edward Pocket brought him a steady supply. Edward was obsessed with his job. Good, Edward, good. You're doing good. Every now and then, Doon would ask him how it was going, and Edward would get a feverish look in his eyes and say, "Ah, it goes by inches, young Doon, by millimeters. I've done this much." He held his thumb and forefinger a tiny distance apart. "And this much remains to be done." He stretched his arms as far apart as they could go. As they would go. It's a gargantuan task. I press forward, but will I finish in my lifetime? It is doubtful. His fingers black with dust. He often came home in the evening later than the workers who went into the village, and he was so tired by then that he usually went straight to bed right after dinner, even though it was still light. See, he could work, but at least he found something he's passionate about. But Sparks people, he could have still worked. Doon would hear him mumbling in his sleep inside the closet. He could make sense of only a few words. Caterpillars, Edward would say. Cathedrals, cattle, chemistry, Christmas. Obviously, he's alphabetizing. Then he'd groan and thrash about, banging his bony limbs against the closet door, and go silent for a while. When he muttered again, he'd be on the He'd be on to a different letter. Hamlet, Harry Potter, Hawaii, heart surgery, hippopotamus, hog farming. Doon imagined that Edward's mind was so stuffed with information by now that there wasn't room for any more, and the excess had started leaking out in the night. Sometimes Doon passed the Sparks School on his way to work in the morning. It was a small building with a wide open porch all around it, where the students often sat to do their lessons. The children of the village, there weren't very many of them, went to school only a few hours a day, and only until they were 10 years old. Kenny Parton went there. He would wave to Doon when he saw him going by, and before the trouble with the tomatoes, the other children would look at Doon curiously, a few of them smiling. But the first time Doon passed the school after the tomato trouble, he saw 15 or 20 cold-eyed faces turned toward him. Someone shouted, "Get out of here!" And someone else threw a crumpled wad of paper over the porch railing at him. He walked faster, looking straight ahead. A moment later, he heard the teacher scolding the class for rudeness, but not very sternly. The next day, as Doon and the others arrived at the Partons for lunch, Kenny peeked out from behind a corner of the house and beckoned to Doon, his eyes wide, his voice even softer and more timid than usual. He said, "You know at school yesterday?" Doon nodded. "I was sorry they yelled at you," Kenny said. "They shouldn't. You didn't do it." "How do you know?" said Doon. He was feeling crabby just then at all residents of Sparks. "Maybe I did." Kenny shook his head. "No," he said, "I don't think so." "Why not?" said Doon. "I can just tell," said Kenny. "I can tell about people. You wouldn't." He gave Doon a quick, shy smile. Doon was touched. Kenny looked like a timid little wisp, but there was something strong inside him. "I wish you didn't have to leave," Kenny said. Doon smiled. "We'll be here for a few months," he said. "Then what?" Kenny asked. "We go away and make our own town." "Where?" asked Kenny. Doon shrugged. "I don't know. Out in those empty places somewhere." Kenny looked down at his feet, stood for a minute in silence. Then he said, "That will be really hard. How will you get food?" Grow it, I guess. Just the way you do here. But you'll be leaving in the month of chilling. That's the beginning of winter. You can't grow food in winter," Kenny said, looking up at Doon with worried eyes. "Winter," said Doon. "What's winter?" "You don't have winter where you came from?" Kenny's eyes grew very round. "You mean it's always summer there?" Doon was confused and slightly alarmed by Kenny's tone. "I don't know those words," he said. Kenny stared at Doon, his face blank with surprise. "Seasons," he said. "They're the seasons. In summer it's hot, in winter it's cold." "That's all right then," said Doon, relieved. "We're used to cold. But you can't grow food in the winter. It's really cold, and clouds come over the sun, and it rains." "Rains?" Kenny was so amazed that his mouth dropped open. He flung his arms up and wiggled his fingers like drops sprinkling down. "Rain! When water comes from the sky, and the river rises, and sometimes it floods, and the dirt turns to mud." Doon felt as if his mind had suddenly stopped. He stared at Kenny's wiggling fingers and tried to grasp what he was saying. Water drops from the sky? But people's clothes would get wet. Everyone would have to stay inside. And if they couldn't grow food... "Wait," he said. "You mean the town leaders know it will be winter when we leave? They know it will be cold and wet?" "I guess so," Kenny said. He lowered his eyes, then looked up again. "Probably they mean to send food with you," he said, "to get you through the winter. That must be it." He gave a small, hopeful smile. "That must be it," he said again. He darted away toward the front door and went into the house. Doon followed. His vision of the future, already shadowed by anxiety, had just grown several shades darker. One morning a week or so later, as Doon came out the door of room 215, he nearly bumped into Tick Hassler, who was running at full speed down the hall. "Something's happened," Tick called to him. "What?" said Doon, breaking into a run himself to keep up with Tick. "I don't know," Tick said, "but I heard people out in front shouting." Tick must have jumped out of bed and not taken time to do anything but throw on his clothes, Doon thought. He hadn't combed his hair, he hadn't tied his shoes, he hadn't even washed his face. There were gray smudges on his neck and below his ear. In the usually well-groomed Tick, these were signs of serious alarm. Doon's heart beat faster. He took the stairs 3 at a time, crossed the lobby, and still following Tick, pushed through the front door. Outside, a crowd stood in the field, staring up at the hotel. Doon ran out to join them and turned around to see what they were seeing. Someone had scrawled words on the wall of the Pioneer, tremendous black letters, rough and scratchy as if written with burnt wood. "Go back to your cave," said the message over and over. "Go back to your cave, go back to your cave." God, these people suck. The few ground floor windows that hadn't already been broken were broken now. Doon stood staring for a minute, feeling sick, and then anger rose in him. This was the work of whoever had slopped that mud message on the plaza. Another ugly message, bolder this time. Around him the others were rushing forward, shouting, staring at the scrawled words. Some of them stood silent and glum, with arms folded or hands in pockets. Others shook their fists in the air and vowed revenge. Tick was more furious than anyone, but he didn't yell. Doon watched him weaving through the crowd, seizing one person after another by the arm, talking in a voice as sharp as a blade, but low and steady. His light blue eyes glinted like steel. "It's what I thought," Tick said. "This shows it. They've pretended to be kind, but their kindness isn't real. Here's what we can know from now on. They hate us." He narrowed his eyes, lowering his voice almost to a hiss, and said it again. "They hate us. They want to get rid of us. Well, I'll tell you what." People all around turned toward him. "They want us to leave, but I'm not leaving. Are you?" He scanned the crowd. "No," said someone. Doon thought about what Kenny had told him. Winter, cold, rain. Maybe Tick is right, he thought. They do hate us. "Do you like being called cave people?" Tick cried. "Do you like being told to crawl back into a cave?" And angry voices, 20, 50, 100 of them, cried, "No! No!" Doon went up close to the wall of the hotel and examined the words scratched there. He pictured the people who had done it, clutching their burnt chunks of wood, writing with big, angry strokes in the dark of the night. Yes, Tick was right. Hatred seethed in those jagged letters. He felt almost as if their strokes had scraped open his skin. All right, my cozy couch potatoes, that is it for chapter 17. I hope you enjoyed this chapter as much as I did, and I can't wait to see you for the next chapter. I would say chapter 18, but actually there's like a mini chapter in between. There's no chapter number, and then the next page, it's chapter 18. This one is the second town meeting. So I guess I'll read that before we read chapter 18. All right, you have a good one, my cozy couch potatoes, and I'll see you next time. Don't forget to share to your friends if you like this content. Bye.